Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you had a great weekend. Welcome back. My name is Manesh Patel, and we're going to get started here with Module 3. We do have a tight schedule today, so due to those constraints, to better get to your questions, please do type them into the chat, and staff will be getting to them as soon as they can. Don't forget, you can also email questions as well. And if we do run out of time to answer questions verbally after each presentation, we'll get to them at the end of the module. So here's part 1 of the agenda for Module 3. Today we'll be tying into what was presented in the 2 prior modules from last week and apply that info to reviewing projects. So we'll have how to review a project 1, which will be presented by Anthony Roblick along with myself. And we'll have how to review a project 2, which will be presented by Chengyi Wu. And after those presentations, Peter will continue on with the groundwater mounding, along with examples of performing the analysis that is required. After that, we'll have our quiz 3. Again, please give it your best shot so that we can grade ourselves on how well we've covered the material. And you will be completing this quiz online during the time allotted. After that, we'll review the quiz answers and, like I said earlier, take any unanswered questions for the material covered in the module as time permits. All right, so let's get started. This presentation, it came about because our review of approved projects during compliance audits showed that projects were being approved, even though the calculations and stormwater management reports submitted for local approvals did not comply with the stormwater management rules and the local stormwater control ordinances. Therefore, should these projects begin to fail, the municipalities involved would be in violation of their respective permits. So here are the goals of this presentation, which are, by no coincidence, the goals of a successful project review. We want reviewers to be able to identify the design and performance standards that must be met on site, review applications for compliance with green infrastructure, stormwater quantity, stormwater quality, groundwater recharge standards, and review BMPs for compliance with the design criteria in the BMP manual. The information required in the stormwater report is specified in the stormwater control ordinance, and checklists are available to help with the review. The reviewer must make sure that any information found missing from the report must be added before approval of the project. The checklist found at this link in the TRA guidance document here on the slide can help with your review of the report and help to just organize your observations and comments. This presentation here is going to be laid out to follow along with this checklist. Now we're going to look at what the reviewer needs to be looking for in the stormwater management report. And the first step in the project review is to check if the application package is complete. So all the items listed here must be part of the application. Pre and post site and grading plans are essential, as are the associated calculations and any drainage area maps. The details in the report section should match up with the information on all the plan pages. Too often we've been finding that some parts or even all the stormwater report do not match the site and grading plans because the report was copied from another project. So the reviewer must also be aware of whether or not the permittee has a more stringent standard of what must be in an application for approval. If so, the reviewer should be looking at all that information. The township's adopted ordinance, which should be posted online, is also a great starting place to find what information is required to be submitted. The townships, they should have adopted the March 2nd, 2021 amended rules. Another issue we see that should be checked right away is that the plans and reports should also be reflected in the maintenance plan so that the BMPs will continue to function as designed. Too often we see maintenance plans submitted that were copied from other projects and they do not match at all the project that was submitted. So like I just said, it's important that the reviewer checks that the site description matches up with the plans. The drainage and discharge points all need to be checked along with any change in pervious or impervious coverage That includes regulated impervious surface and regulated motor vehicle surface for each sub-drainage area. And then also soil information for the site should be included and be accurate. Lisa covered the use of the web soil survey as a means for getting your soil information, and more guidance will be provided later today. As a side note, print versions of county soil surveys are not always up to date, and they shouldn't be used as your sole resource. The report must include the following information regarding design and performance standards when it comes to what's required, along with any applicable variances, waivers, or exemptions, and how the standards will be met. Again, we find that this is often missing or does not match up to what is on the plan. So this is very important that this information is provided. The reviewer must be sure that the following calculations are included in the report. Time of concentration, as was discussed in Module 2 by Anthony, is essential to characterizing a site. Time of concentration must be calculated and included in the report. Some permittees may require that this information be submitted on a CD so that it can be checked. No matter the format, though, it's important to include all this information, and that includes storm routings, hydrographs, the groundwater recharge spreadsheet, the mounding analysis, if it's applicable, and water quality calculations, and just make sure it matches what's on the plans. So you saw this slide earlier in Module 1 in the overview presentation. Always check whether the project meets the definition of major development, because there could be a chance that it doesn't. Also be sure to also check the permittee's definition of major development, as it may be stricter than the department standard. To find that, the reviewer should check the permittee's ordinances. A note here, though, you need to distinguish the different types of surfaces, whether it be regulated motor vehicle surface, regulated impervious surface, other pervious surfaces, and etc. in the report. There are one or more major development thresholds that may apply to the project that the reviewer should be aware of, including the residential site improvement standards, the permittee's stormwater control ordinance, and the NJDEP land use regulations. As you see here, each has a definition that you need to pay attention to when you do a review. Once the reviewer has verified that the required information has been submitted and is accurate, they can begin to actually review the design and performance standards. The plans and report must address the information listed here. This information is crucial to determining whether the project was designed properly. Information such as whether the project is discharging to a flood hazard area or a Category 1 waterway are often not included, and therefore they're overlooked during the reviews. This information may also determine whether or not the project requires input from other agencies such as NJDEP Land Use or even the Pinelands Commission. So under the current rules, a reviewer must ensure the proposed design complies with the design criteria that's established in the BMP manual, which in turn ensures the design meets the design and performance standards of the rules. If something is an alternative design or method of calculation, the department must be notified of this approval. Along with the other standards, reviewers must ensure the BMPs follow the green infrastructure standards, and for this, the BMP manual provides the design criteria and considerations for the individual types of GI BMPs. If the reviewer did allow for waivers or variances, they must be sure that they were applicable. Can waivers or variances even be granted? It's not really a straightforward answer, and to resolve this somewhat gray area, it's been defined a little bit better in the new rules. So the amendments to 7:8-4.6 were made to clarify the conditions that would warrant the granting of a variance by municipality for a major development project. The amendments they're intended to ensure that municipalities are not granting variances under inappropriate circumstances. Municipalities do not have to grant variances, and they do not have to create a mitigation plan if they do not plan to grant variances. But if they do, they can create a mitigation plan that allows the evaluation of mitigation projects that are suggested by applicants, allowing for the consideration of projects that are submitted by applicants as is permitted at NJAC 7:8-4.6. To eliminate any potential misconception that a variance is an exemption from attaining the stormwater management standards, the word exemption was removed from this section as part of the rule amendment. With the amended version of the rules, the ability to grant variances requires a little more effort by the applicant. Now, there must be a demonstration that it is technically impracticable to meet one or more of the design standards. The only allowable variances are for engineering, environmental, or safety reasons, and they have to be spelled out very clearly here. Cost, it can't really be a factor here. The old low impact development checklist often included statements that somewhat was not economically feasible, and yet cost information was not formally reviewed. Previously, there may have been a site-wide variance allowed, but now the rule located at section 4.6 states that a municipality's approval of a variance shall apply to an individual drainage area and design and performance standard, and shall not apply to an entire site or project unless an applicant provides the required analysis for each drainage area within the site and each design and performance standard. There's a lot more to the mitigation requirements that must be met to obtain approval of a variance in the amended version of the rules. Mitigation must be part of the municipal stormwater management plan and follow these new requirements. It must be selected from the municipal list of mitigation projects, or could be proposed by the applicant if it meets the criteria for the municipal mitigation plan. It must be approved no later than the preliminary or final site plan approval. It must be located in the same HUC 14. Must be constructed concurrently or prior to the major development. Must meet the green infrastructure standards. And the entity assuming the responsibility of maintenance for the project must submit a written agreement to the review agency. And lastly, the approved variance must now be submitted to the county review agency and DEP within 30 days of approval. Mitigation is required to receive a variance from the green infrastructure standards, but be aware that certain BMPs cannot be used as mitigation measures and that there are minimum sizing and drainage area limitations. So note that vegetative filter strips and grass swales are excluded as mitigation measures as they don't address quantity control and groundwater recharge. Green infrastructure BMPs that are used for mitigation need to be sized to manage the water quality design storm at a minimum and are subject to the specified drainage area limitations. Variances from the other standards are as shown on this slide. Note that there's no waiver or variance allowed for groundwater mounding. That's because the steps listed in Chapter 13 of the BMP manual make it clear that if the selected BMP fails to pass the groundwater mounding analysis, another BMP must be selected and assessed, meaning that a whole redesign is going to be required. The reviewer should also be able to determine whether linear development exemptions exist on the site. The following linear development exemptions may be granted if the requirements are met for each. So those are construction of underground utility lines if revegetated upon completion, construction of above ground utility lines if existing conditions are maintained to the maximum extent practicable, and the construction of a public pedestrian access if it's made of permeable materials and it's no greater than 14 feet wide. And then finally, the reviewer may allow waivers to be granted for the enlargement of a road or railroad, or the construction or enlargement of a public pedestrian access if the requirements here are met. And they're as followed. Public need for a project that can't be met another way. Design and performance standards met to the maximum extent practicable. Meeting the standards would require condemning existing in-use structures, and the applicant does not have and cannot get rights to other lands for mitigation. These specific exemptions were discussed earlier in Module 1. Water quantity is exempt if it's in a tidal flood hazard area and flooding will not increase. Water quality is exempt if the site has a NGIPD's permit with a specific effluent limit, and groundwater recharge is exempt for previously developed areas in an urban redevelopment area. The last one is also going to be discussed a little bit more in part 2 of how to review a project, so I'm not going to get too in depth with it here, but the reviewer should be aware of them. It is important that the reviewer is aware of what urban redevelopment exemptions are and where they can be applied, though. Urban redevelopment exemptions can only be granted to previously developed areas of a site. The existence of woody vegetation is a telltale sign of whether this exemption can be granted. If the reviewer finds that woody vegetation has returned to areas of a previously developed site, the exemption is not going to be allowed. Removing woody vegetation and putting new construction over this portion of the site is going to result in a loss of groundwater recharge, so that is why. The reviewer can check the NJGO web to determine whether the rest of this information is going to be applicable to the site. So in summary, the following are the possible variances, exemptions, and waivers that may be applicable to the site, but it is important that the reviewer takes the time to make sure that they can be applied and that they're only applied to the specific portions of the site that meet these specific requirements. So moving on, the next thing the reviewer should be looking at is if the applicant is meeting the design and performance standards using green infrastructure. The rules require that design and performance standards are to be met using green infrastructure. The rules require that GI-BMPs be used to address the requirements for groundwater recharge, stormwater runoff quantity control, and stormwater runoff quality. Subsection 5.2 of the rules include 3 tables, and they list those BMPs that may be used to meet the design and performance standards. The tables found there specify information on how each BMP may be used. So Table 5.1 is going to coincide with Chapter 9 of the BMP manual, which are the GI BMPs. And they include cisterns, dry wells, grass swales, green roofs, GI MTDs, pervious paving systems, small-scale bioretention systems, small-scale infiltration basins, small-scale sand filters that are GI, and vegetative filter strips. Some of the BMPs cannot receive runoff from motor vehicle surfaces, and therefore they do not address water quality. So examples of those are like cisterns and green roofs. Others don't offset the discharge of stormwater runoff from the 210 and 100-year design storms, so they cannot meet the quantity control requirement. And something like that is like a dry well. And of course, not all MTDs are considered GI, but the ones that are considered, they're going to be included here in Chapter 9. And these MTDs have a vegetative or soil component that meet the GI definition. And lastly, these small scale systems listed here, they have a limited drainage area that they can treat compared to other BMPs. As you can see, the column on the left includes the name of the BMP, and the column on the right includes the maximum contributory drainage area. So for example, if you're using a dry well, the maximum contributory drainage area is going to be 1 acre, MTDs 2.5, and so on and so forth. Do note that this is Table 5.1, so again, we're only talking about MTDs that are approved for green infrastructure. In the past, we've seen projects that propose to design two small-scale GI BMPs that each have drainage areas just less than the maximum allowed contributory drainage area, and they'd be side by side in a corner of the site so as to try and get around the drainage limitation. However, a design like this is not going to meet the GI definition. So to review, green infrastructure means a stormwater management measure that manages stormwater close to its source. So the design of small-scale GI BMPs shall be distributed throughout the site and manage the runoff closer to the source that is generating the runoff. So as you can see from the first diagram here, the GI BMPs, they're all clustered together at the top. The second diagram shows two large scale BMPs in proximity of each other. And these BMPs would need to be spread out from each other to cover the entirety of the runoff of the site. Chapter 10 BMPs, they can be used to address stormwater runoff quantity control. These BMPs can have larger contributory drainage areas than the BMPs listed in Chapter 9. So Chapter 10 BMPs include large-scale bioretention systems, large-scale infiltration basins, large-scale green infrastructure sand filters, standard constructed wetlands, and green infrastructure wet ponds. Note that though I said they can address quantity, these BMPs may only be used to meet water quality and recharge if a waiver or variance is granted. BMPs in Chapter 11 are non-green infrastructure, and they will always require a waiver or variance before they can be used. So it's not anticipated that these BMPs will be used much in the future because of what is required in order to grant a waiver or approve a variance. But as for some of the BMPs noted on this table, blue roofs, they don't have a reuse component, and extended detention basins are typically large and require additional treatment to meet water quality standards. The majority of MTDs currently do not have a soil or vegetative component, so they will fall into Chapter 11. And then you see non-GI sand filters, subsurface gravel wetlands, and non-GI wet ponds to round out Chapter 11. The next thing the reviewer needs to look at is stormwater runoff quantity. Water quantity impacts must be addressed to not only prevent increased flooding due to development, but also to avoid increased flow rates, which can significantly degrade water bodies downstream from a site. So in Module 1, we covered the different options a designer can choose to follow. So I'll briefly go through those options to meet water quantity, as we found this to be done incorrectly in many of our reviews. It's important to note that the reviewer must make sure that all points of discharge from the site must meet the water quantity standard, and if not, the project is not going to be compliant. So let's begin with taking a look at topography. Topography is important in identifying where the stormwater flows and is required to determine drainage areas and the time of concentration. Reviewers should be able to find the topography information on the plans and make sure that it's accurate. This, in some cases, may even require the reviewer to physically see the site as well. It's often difficult for us to find drainage maps in these stormwater reports. We also see situations where the drainage calculations in the reports do not even match up with the drainage maps in the plans. We need to see existing and proposed contours. We need to see point of analysis, TC flow paths. We need to see drainage area to each point of analysis. The reviewer must make sure that the data used in the calculations matches the various maps and plans. This information must also be included on the drainage plans as well. It's very important to understand that each drainage area needs to be calculated separately. The reviewer should see the following calculated separately for each drainage area and must check the calculations for each drainage area. you should not assume that if one calculation is correct, then the rest are correct as well. So here's an example site. The flow was evaluated as sheet flow directed primarily in a southerly direction. However, we received complaints of flooding along the road lying to the east of the project and from the area northwest of the project. It was determined that the drainage areas were not delineated correctly. Whether or not that was due to an incorrect evaluation of the topography, that's unknown. But this shows why it's important to properly evaluate it and delineate drainage areas. To prevent those issues from occurring, the reviewer must verify that all drainage areas are outlined correctly. The proper time of concentration flow path is used, and the time of concentration is calculated properly. The reviewer needs to make sure that any natural ponding on site is included in the model. This is often overlooked, and ignoring it for the existing condition means the allowed proposed volumes will be larger than they actually are, or should be as well. On the same example site that was shown before, there was a 6-inch deep ponded area within the shape depicted. This was ignored, and the basin was made significantly larger than was needed. If there are any questions as to whether areas of ponding exist on site and it can't be determined from photos of it, you may just have to go in person and see the actual site for yourself. The reviewer should be checking land cover next. Land cover should be clearly marked on the plans and be specific to what the land actually is. It should also include any existing BMPs that are on site. The reviewer must verify that the plans and cover descriptions in the report match what is actually on the site. Aerial photos can be used to make sure the most pervious cover that existed in the past 5 years has been used in the calculations. Again, it may be necessary for the reviewer to verify land cover conditions in person to make sure that they've been accurately described. So Lisa went through how to determine soils, but just to reiterate, it is important to make an accurate determination of the soil types on site. The type of soil greatly is going to affect the functionality of a BMP. So again, the reviewer can find soil info at the NRCS Web Soil Survey webpage, and that link is provided here on the slide. If information on the site's soils cannot be found, use the methods found in Chapter 12 to determine the hydrologic soil group, either from the default HSG method or from soil testing. Making sure that the soil data for the site is accurate is a critical part of the review process. Inaccurate soil information can make or break a stormwater BMP. So good practice generally is to review soil testing first before you go anywhere else. So as stated earlier, the review checklist is an excellent guide for assisting one to review these major development projects. Here are a couple of items that we need to take a look at when reviewing a project. We need to make sure that the Manning's sheet flow roughness coefficient is 0.4 or less for the TC calculations. So according to NRCS, the maximum Manning's roughness coefficient that you can use is 0.8 for woods with dense underbrush. But in New Jersey, we do not have that situation. And the maximum Manning's coefficient for sheet flow in New Jersey that can be used is 0.4. Anthony covered this in Module 2, and more on this can be found in Chapter 5 of the BMP manual. We also need to determine if the TC in the pre-construction is appropriately calculated. We need to make sure that they are not underestimating this value. The reviewer should look at time of concentration. Information on how to calculate it can be found in Chapter 5 of the BMP manual and the National Engineering Handbook. So you can look back through the handouts for calculations presentation for Module 2 for more information on the correct way to calculate this. So in summary, the reviewer must make sure that the sheet flow, shallow concentrated flow, and channel flow inputs are all correct, that they must make sure that the proper TC was used with the corresponding method. They must check that the pre-construction TC calculations, and the reviewer must now check the post-construction TC calculations, as it's no longer allowable that you can assume this value. Next on the review checklist is to identify if runoff from impervious and pervious surfaces are calculated separately and not with a weighted average curve number. We need to make sure that the curve number selection is appropriate of the land cover, and if the rational method is used, then does the runoff coefficient make sense? So if you recall from Module 2, the acceptable methods of water quantity calculations are the rational method and the NRCS method. The reviewer should make sure that one of these two methods is used for the stormwater report. Just a quick reminder, if the rational method is used, the maximum drainage area is 20 acres. Curve numbers and runoff coefficients are used to calculate the amount of runoff caused by a specific amount of precipitation. So curve numbers being associated with the NRCS methodology and runoff coefficients associated with the rational method. The reviewer must be sure that the curve numbers or runoff coefficients correspond with each specific area based on land cover and hydrologic soil groups. Both of the curve number and runoff coefficients are based on a presumption of good hydrologic condition, unless the design engineer provides evidence showing different conditions. Again, this was covered in Module 2 as well. So here's an example of what a land cover table might look like from an engineering report. You see here the land cover, the area of the cover, soil types, HSGs, and associated curve numbers. The reviewer must check these numbers and land cover types against what is shown on the plans. Sometimes you could see that they don't match up, so always check them to make sure that they correspond to each other. In all, the reviewer must check the curve numbers and runoff coefficients are justified in the report. You can verify these in the National Engineering Handbook and for curve numbers, and also Chapter 5 of the BMP Manual for runoff coefficients. The reviewer is responsible for making sure the chosen values are reasonable and that they're accurate. So I'm going to hand it off to Anthony Roblick, who is now going to take you through runoff routing. Anthony?
Okay, thanks, Manesh. Let me just share my screen here. Okay, continuing on with runoff routing. As mentioned previously, runoff from pervious and impervious areas must be routed separately. Routing programs may require unchecking a box to separately calculate runoff from pervious and impervious areas. And it's the reviewer's responsibility to make sure that this has occurred and the areas are indeed routed separately. This can be verified by confirming that the printouts provided do not show a composite curve number. And the reviewer must also make sure that a weighted average of pervious and impervious areas was not used. If an offsite discharge point or point of analysis receives runoff from several sub-drainage areas, the peak flow rate at the discharge point cannot be an arithmetic sum of the peak flow rates from each of the sub-drainage areas. The hydrographs from each sub-drainage area should be combined to find the peak flow rate at the discharge point. So one situation that we often do not see correctly addressed is depression storage. The reviewer should identify if any depression storage areas exist on site and that they are included in the model. Depressions can provide stormwater management benefits and should be protected if possible. One problem that arises from ignoring depression storage in the pre-development condition is that it's not possible to accurately calculate time of concentration. The reviewer must make sure that the depression storage is being modeled as an existing basin in existing conditions. So in general, this is the procedure to follow when reviewing existing condition depression storage somewhere within the confines of a proposed development. The reviewer must make sure that the depression area is modeled, the time of concentration is calculated from the outlet of the depression to the point of interest correctly, lag the depression outflow hydrograph by the calculated time of concentration, and calculate the time of concentration for the remaining area of the site and route it separately. So if you recall, this is the example of depression storage that was shown earlier. Had the reviewer conducted a proper review of the existing depression storage area, there most likely wouldn't be the issues that are there on site today. So again, the reviewer must review the time of concentration to the depression area, calculate the stage storage data for the depression area, and model the outlet of from the depression area as either a weir or some other outlet or overflow rather, and route the contributory drainage area to the depression area. So this is an example of depression storage modeled in HydroCAD. The contributory drainage area is routed to the depression, and the reviewer can input the parameters into HydroCAD or other modeling software to make sure that the depression area was calculated correctly. So in this case, the depression is modeled as a small detention structure discharging over a 22-foot long broad-crested weir. And the lowest elevation here is 49.1 feet, and the highest is 49.7 feet. And all of this information is taken from the site conditions. Next, the reviewer should check if the rainfall depth parameters are correct for the site and that the appropriate rainfall distribution is used. So the rainfall depth and intensity information should come from the sources, either through the NOAA Precipitation Frequency Data Server, for the Water Quality Design Storm, the BMP Manual Chapter 5. And NRCS has developed distributions for New Jersey, including the NOAA C and D, which the BMP Manual requires use of now. These are already built into many stormwater modeling programs, such as HydroCAD. The reviewer should check that the correct distribution is selected, dependent upon where the site's located within the state. Chapter 5 of the BMP manual includes an example of using the modified rational method. The reviewer must make sure that the report shows critical storage volume calculations, and detention basin designs must be based on a storm event that results in critical storage volume. Next, the reviewer should identify if the appropriate hydrograph type is used. So for hydrographs, when reviewing NRCS method calculations, the SCS unit hydrograph should only really be used outside of the coastal plain area of the state, except in very rare cases where the design engineer can prove that the conditions that characterize use of the Delmarva hydrograph are in no way present on site within the coastal plain, or use of the Delmarva hydrograph is not permitted, such as when sizing an MTD. But other than those cases, the SCS unit hydrograph should not be used within the coastal plain. And correspondingly, the Delmarva hydrograph should always be used for sites within the coastal plain area. And use of the Delmarva hydrograph is actually only acceptable within the coastal plain. But no matter where you are in the state and which hydrograph is being used, the reviewer must make sure that the same hydrograph is used for both the proposed and existing conditions. So after having checked the input parameters, we should review compliance with the stormwater runoff quantity standard. Option 1 is almost exclusively used for redevelopment. The BMP Manual Chapter 5 includes a discussion, an example illustrating this. As mentioned in Module 1, in order to meet Option 1, the post-construction hydrograph cannot exceed at any point in time the pre-construction hydrograph. And so here's an example of a post-construction hydrograph exceeding a pre-construction hydrograph. And at first glance, the difference appears to be negligible. However, the rules do not permit any exceedance. And if we were to zoom in on this hydrograph starting at around 11.9 hours, we would see that the post-construction hydrograph has a higher value than the pre-construction. And so here it is zoomed in. And when we look into the comparison of these hydrographs, we can see that multiple values from the post-construction hydrograph exceed those from pre-construction. Although the peak flow rates of the post-construction hydrograph are less than pre-construction, the shorter time of concentration under the post-construction condition results in this exceedance. So we won't be covering option 2 as that was previously covered, and skip ahead on to option 3. Option 3 is the most commonly used, although it doesn't mean that we don't see errors in its use. This option requires use of stormwater BMPs with a detention function and outlet control structure to attenuate flow. So here's a list of the various Chapter 9 and 10 BMPs that can provide detention. Note that these BMPs are considered green infrastructure, which are required to be used to meet the stormwater runoff quantity control standard. Note that Chapter 11 BMPs, which are not listed here, would only be eligible to meet the stormwater runoff quantity requirement if a waiver or variance from NJAC 7:8-5.3 was granted. So as we mentioned earlier, the report shall provide routing calculations of all design storms for every subdrainage area. The reviewer should check that pervious and impervious surfaces are separately calculated, check NOAA rainfall distribution, and check the runoff depth. Continuing on, this is an example routing calculation printout. The reviewer should check if exfiltration was used and if the orifice used meets the 2.5-inch minimum requirement. On this printout, it shows exfiltration is included in the routing calculation and is denoted as discarded runoff. Note that this BMP design does not infiltrate the entire 100-year storm into the subsoil. As you can see on the slide, primary means the discharge from the 100-year storm through an outlet structure, such as an orifice or weir. Infiltration of the entire 210 or 100-year storm is allowed only when the existing site conditions are such that no runoff leaves the site in the pre-construction condition scenario, thereby constraining the design to infiltrate 100% of the volume produced by the post-construction condition for the same design storm. So in this case, the maximum storm that can be entirely infiltrated is the largest storm event with no runoff leaving the site in the pre-construction condition. Or the other option is the volume of stormwater runoff to be fully infiltrated is required by law or rule implemented by the Highlands Commission, the Highlands Council, or any other stormwater review agency with jurisdiction over the project. But those are the only two cases. The reviewer must check groundwater mounding analysis for any BMPs that infiltrate runoff into the subsoil. If there is no groundwater mounding analysis in the submitted report, the reviewer shall ask the design engineer to provide it. Often the groundwater mounding analysis will show the mounding as rising above the bottom of the BMP, which means that the runoff discarded through the basin bottom into the subsoil is reduced from what is assumed in the routing calculations. And if this is the case, the routing calculation must be adjusted to use a smaller exfiltration rate, which will result in more flow being discharged through the outlet control structure. And if more flow is discharged from the outlet structure, then you should check if the peak flow rate from the BMP is still below the maximum allowable peak flow rate. And if that peak rate is above, then the basin size or the outlet structure may need to be adjusted to provide more storage volume during the design storm. The detention component for green infrastructure BMPs can be the detention of storage volume above the surface of the water quality design storm. For example, a small-scale infiltration basin that is designed to have an outlet orifice at the maximum water level elevation of the water quality design storm, and additional outlets for attenuating runoff from the 210 and 100-year design storm. Alternatively, you may design an under-drained bioretention system with storage pipes below the basin to provide a detention space for the 210 and 100-year design storms. Take note that provided storage space for detention should be located within the footprint of the basin. Designing a GI BMP with detention component located downstream outside the basin's footprint does not meet the design requirements as stated in the BMP manual. The next section the reviewer should check is stormwater runoff quality. The stormwater runoff quality requirements are shown here. For new development, the proposed design must remove 80% of total suspended solids and stormwater runoff generated from the water quality design storm from the net increase in motor vehicle surface. And although there is no numerical target, the reviewer must ensure the design removes nutrients to the maximum extent feasible. And as mentioned back in Module 1, the threshold for the water quality requirement is a 1/4 acre net increase in regulated motor vehicle surface. Each individual drainage area must meet the 80% requirement unless there is convergence prior to discharge from the site. Drainage areas discharging to different locations cannot be averaged together. And additionally, water discharging within a riparian zone must reduce TSS by 95%. So a little about regulated motor vehicle surface. So regulated motor vehicle surface can mean more than just a brand new paved parking lot. It also includes pervious areas that are intended to be used by motor vehicles. Additionally, motor vehicle surface that is currently receiving water quality treatment by vegetation or soil, by an existing stormwater management measure, or by treatment at a wastewater treatment plant, where the water quality treatment will be modified or removed, is also considered regulated motor vehicle surface. With regard to pervious paving areas, the reviewer must make sure that pervious paving areas are treated as regulated motor vehicle surface when considering stormwater quality. Although pervious paving areas designed in accordance with the BMP manual can assist in providing the required TSS removal. Runoff generated by a rooftop is considered clean because it's not typically a significant source of TSS. However, it can be a significant source of nutrients, which the reviewer should make sure is considered in the design. Because of this, pretreatment of rooftop runoff may be a requirement depending on the BMP used, and the reviewer should consult the BMP manual for pretreatment information. Okay, in the previous modules, we talked about the water quality design storm, which is unique to New Jersey. It's the storm that introduces TSS into our collection systems and waterways. It's nonlinear in its distribution, and it's fairly intense. And here's a graph depicting the total rainfall from water quality, from the water quality design storm versus time. As you can see, the storm event begins gradually, with the most intense portion of the storm occurring in the middle portion of the storm's duration, and then the storm tapers off towards the end. And here's the graph depicting the rainfall intensity duration curve. When you look at the intensity duration curve, and this was developed by the department, you see the smallest value for time of concentration is 10 minutes, and that's why the rational method minimum TC is 10 minutes. So here's a list of the various Chapter 9 BMPs that can provide stormwater quality treatment. These BMPs are considered green infrastructure, which is required to be used to meet the stormwater quality control standard. Note that Chapter 10 and 11 BMPs, which are not listed here, would only be eligible to meet the stormwater quality requirement if a waiver or variance, again from NJAC 7:8-5.3, was granted. The BMP manual is designed to help the reviewer identify the design criteria that must be met for proposed BMP to merit the approved TSS removal rate. And in addition to the TSS removal rates, there are phosphorus and nitrogen removal rates associated with almost every BMP in the manual. This information can be found in Chapter 4. And as seen in that table, not every BMP is rated for 80% TSS removal. Sometimes a series of BMPs are used to meet the 80% TSS removal requirement, or the more stringent 95% rate for projects discharging within a riparian zone. And when that's the case, an effective TSS removal rate would be calculated using the equation shown under the third bullet here. So when a combination of BMPs are used, justification for the placement order is needed, and that's according to the hierarchy seen here under the first bullet. The reviewer should verify that two of the same kind of BMP are not used in series, as the down gradient one typically will not be as effective. Nutrient removal is required for all major developments. Some BMPs have nutrient removal capabilities, but the best way to handle nutrient removal is by source control. As mentioned earlier, water quality BMPs must be designed in accordance with the BMP manual. Alternative designs may be used, but these designs must be submitted to the department for approval. So in summary, when conducting a water quality review, the reviewer must, one, ensure BMPs used on site meet the stormwater quality standard, and they're from table 5.1, are adequate to achieve the required TSS removal rate and are designed in accordance with the BMP manual. Two, ensure that stormwater runoff that requires water quality treatment is actually being treated. And three, ensure that a deed notice of the stormwater BMPs used on site is submitted for approval and recorded in the county clerk's office prior to the start of construction. So there are some general design criteria that applies to all water quality BMPs. All BMPs must drain down in 72 hours unless they are designed as water features. All infiltrating BMPs must have a minimum 2-foot separation from the seasonal high groundwater elevation. And under-drained green infrastructure BMPs must have a 1-foot separation. So here's a list of the most commonly used water quality BMPs. So every BMP in the manual has a summary page or pages. This is the page for small-scale infiltration basins. The paragraph at the top describes how the BMP functions to remove pollutants and lists a TSS removal rate. The table shown below the description lists whether a BMP can be used to meet each of the design and performance standards. As mentioned previously back in Module 1, the green leaf denotes if a particular BMP meets the definition of green infrastructure, and any design type that does not qualify for this use will be so noted. If there's a TSS rating noted across from the gold percent sign, that means the BMP is rated for that TSS removal rate if all of the design criteria are met, including there being a maintenance plan. And notice the design summary tables are now shaded different colors, and the chapter titles are green for Chapter 9, Green Infrastructure BMPs, blue for Chapter 10, and black for 11. The footers are similarly updated, and this is to make the BMP manual chapters addressing BMPs more visually distinct from the previous version of the BMP manual. So small-scale infiltration basins are an extremely common BMP for water quality. Small-scale infiltration basins achieve the 80% TSS removal rate and may also be used to meet the stormwater quantity and also the groundwater recharge requirements. So they're very versatile. On Under the current rules, only the volume generated by the water quality design storm may be infiltrated, unless specific cases allow for the infiltration of larger storm events, as previously noted. That means there should be one or more orifices or weirs in an outlet to discharge larger storms. This type of basin has additional design criteria in the chapter and also references the soil testing chapter, chapter 12, because studies have shown that frequent inundation during the larger storms reduces the ability of the basin to infiltrate runoff due to groundwater mounting impacts, and that leads to an impaired basin. And a failed or impaired basin will require retrofit or major maintenance. So during your review, you must check that the minimum thickness of the appropriate sand is present, and check that the basin is not used as a stockpile location during construction. Look at the existing grading plan and figure out how heavy equipment is going to clear this portion of the site. Make sure there's anti-compaction language on the plans as well as built soil testing. So small-scale infiltration basins designed for water quantity must have an outlet structure. The reviewer must also not see any underdrains or liners in the design or any topsoil or vegetation in the landscape or planning plan. There must be no standing water in the basin 72 hours after the precipitation stops. So here's an example of two infiltration basins. The top one is functioning correctly. The bottom one has ponding at the inlet locations, and there's a lot of vegetation established. The outlet is over on the far right of the picture. This is a pretty big basin. So one question is, how will compaction from vegetative maintenance impact the ability of the basin to infiltrate? Additionally, the vegetation that is breaking down in standing water forms a biofilm that can cover the sand layer and greatly reduce the basin's ability to infiltrate. Okay, now a little on bioretention systems. Bioretention systems provide more variability to address the rule requirements and are very commonly used. Shown here is the summary page from the BMP manual for this chapter on small-scale bioretention systems. You can see it's kind of analogous to the infiltration basin chapter. Small-scale bioretention systems rely on healthy, dense vegetation. The type of vegetation and the thickness of the planting bed determine the TSS removal rate. And this table is from the small-scale bioretention chapter. Rain gardens are a type of small-scale bioretention system and are encouraged under the new rules. There are even types with under drains to help facilitate drainage. Small-scale bioretention systems have specific requirements regarding the depth of the planting media and what that planting media consists of. So this planting media is designed to support dense vegetation, but it also conveys stormwater. And one thing to notice here is that the composition of inorganics is measured by volume, and organics is measured by weight here. Small-scale bioretention systems also have specific requirements in regard to stormwater quality depth, bottom slope, and the density of vegetation, and they can all be found in the BMP manual. The reviewer must make sure that this criteria is met for any bioretention system that's being proposed. So in general, all infiltration type BMPs have specific criteria associated with them, and reviewers should be sure that the criteria is being met. And we'll talk a little about that in the following few slides here. So one thing reviewers must check is that the soil permeability was tested and a factor of 2 was applied to any tested permeability rate. Also, infiltration BMPs may have design permeabilities between 1/2 inch per hour up to 10 inches per hour. So when we get into the groundwater mounting analysis, which you can also read about in chapter 13, you'll see that infiltrating stormwater causes a temporary and localized rise in the groundwater table. If this rise is great enough, it can slow down the rate of infiltration so that the BMP does not drain within 72 hours. This means the basin must be either enlarged or retrofitted. And that's why it's so important to make sure that the soil testing is done correctly and that the seasonal high water table is properly located. And again, the separation is 2 feet for infiltrating BMPs. And lastly, when reviewing infiltration basin designs, make sure, I mentioned this before, but it's important to make sure that there's anti-compaction language present along with post-construction soil testing. It would also be helpful to include the drain down information in the maintenance plan checklists and logs so that it's easy to find in the future during maintenance activities. Thank you for your attention. Here's our contact information. Please don't hesitate to contact us if you have any questions. We'd be happy to help. And up next should be Changi Wu with part 2 of how to review a project.
Okay, we have one question that I have not answered. That's from Justin. And it's about why some BMP that cannot be used for meeting quantity standard. Is that your question? Oh, okay. Justin is asking table 5.2. So the BMPs in table 5.2, you can see the name are pretty similar to the BMP's name that in 5.1. The difference that, for example, infiltration basin in table 5.1 is called small scale BMP, small scale infiltration BMP, and in 5.2 is only infiltration BMP. And the difference between them is that in the small scale infiltration BMP, that has the drainage limitation. You cannot use the infiltration BMP greater than 2.5 acres when you want to use that infiltration BMP to provide water quality treatment. But you can use infiltration BMP that has a drainage area greater than 2.5 acres when you use that for quantity control. And then it doesn't have that small scale 2.5 acre limitation. I don't know whether that my explanation clear enough. Maybe Anthony, you want to add something, or Justin, you want to unmute yourself and we can have some discussion. Okay, I think we probably explain that. So we can take 5 minutes break, and that's 2:05. So we come back at 2:10 and continue our presentation. Thank you.
Justin, also I will add that if you want to reread it and then send us an email, we are happy to answer your questions that way as well. Okay, thank you, everybody. We will take our break. Thank you, everyone, for the excellent questions. We will be getting started with how to review a project part 2 in just a moment.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chen Yu. I'm going to continue the discussion of how to review a project. In this presentation, I will talk about how to review BMP for compliance with the design criteria in the BMP menu. And also I will discuss about MTT design and also learn about the safety requirement in the stormwater management rules when you design a BMP. And also we will have some discussion regarding the groundwater recharge spreadsheets. And my presentation is to let the reviewer to identify the design and performance standard that must be on the site. And also you have to review the BMP that's submitted by the engineer, and you have to review that following the design requirement, the design criteria in the BMP menu. And here is a reminder of the BMP that in our rules in table 5-1, those BMPs are only that can be used for quality, quantity, and recharge without getting any waiver or exemption. And the corresponding chapter is in chapter 9. And the BMP here is only for when you can use the BMP listed here in table -2 or chapter 10 for quantity requirements. But if you cannot use this BMP for quality treatment or groundwater recharge control. And for the BMP in table 5-3, this is BMP that you have to get a waiver or exemption before you use those. This is BMPs in quality, quantity, and recharge. And I'm going to discuss some highlights of the design criteria in some of the BMP chapters that's often being used to meet the stormwater management rules or the stormwater control ordinance. So the first one is cistern. If you want to design a cistern, the storage volume needs to be at least for the runoff from the water quality design storm, and also that the cistern needs to be emptied by the reuse demand within 72 hours. And for dry well, the design volume of a dry well cannot exceed the runoff from the water quality design storm. You can design a dry well that provide the volume smaller than water quality design storm, but you cannot exceed, the volume cannot exceed the water quality design storm. And although a dry well cannot be used to treat runoff from motor vehicle surface, it can prevent the clean roof runoff from being commingled with the dirty runoff from the motor vehicle surface. So that, for example, you direct the roof runoff into dry well, so it would not commingle with the runoff from the driveway. So which can reduce the downstream BMP that needed for water quality treatment. And next is pervious paving system. If you want to design the pervious paving system, the storage volume needs to be at least equal to the runoff from the water quality design stone. And when you do the calculation of how much is the runoff, the volume of runoff, although there's no surface runoff, possibly from a previous paving system, because all the runoff in the small stone would go down directly through the surface course, you still need to use 98 for the CN curve number, so you can have the right estimate of what the amount of precipitation falling on the previous paving system, and that need to be stored underneath the surface course. The next one is the small scale infiltration BMP. And I think we have a question regarding this, that the infiltration BMP means that being designed to infiltrate runoff into subsoil. So it cannot have an under drain system to direct the runoff away from going down to the subsoil. So if you want to direct the runoff not going to the subsurface, you would have to choose other BMP. For example, some small scale bioretention system that would allow you to have the under drain, the runoff goes through the top soil media, would corrected by the runoff, and then being conveyed to downstream. That's for the bioretention system that you can have under drain, but for the infiltration BMP, you can't. And also, infiltration basin, a BMP cannot have vegetation on the bottom of the basin because the infiltration means to infiltrate the runoff as much as possible into subsoil. Vegetation on the bottom of the infiltration basin would take away some part of the runoff, so it would not be maximize the runoff into the subsoil. So an infiltration BMP cannot have vegetation on the bottom of the BMP. And for the small scale infiltration BMP, for the vegetated filter strip, we have seen like some designer claim that the piece of the lawn as a vegetated filter strip. So we want to remind that not every piece of vegetated area can be recognized as a vegetated filter strip. Only those vegetated areas that are designed and maintained strictly in compliance with the design criteria of the vegetated filter strip chapter can be recognized to have the total suspended solid removal rate. And speaking of the total suspended removal rate of vegetated filter strip is depending on the type of vegetation, the soil, the hydraulic soil group, and the slope. And there are figures and curves that you can use to find the TSS removal rate associated with those parameters. And next one, I want to talk about the wet ponds. And as you see that wet pond that shows in table 5-2 and 5-3. So let's talk about the difference between them. For the non-GI wet pond, which means that in table 5-3, and that is very rare for now, because after the current stormwater management rule was ineffective in 2021. You can only use that for quantity quality treatment when you get a waiver of variance from the NJAC 7 column 8-53. And for the wet pond, for the non-GI wet pond, the minimum, the permanent pool surface area has to be at least 0.25 acres. And the ratio between the permanent pool volume to the water quality design stone is at least 1:1. And the minimum drainage area is 20 acres, unless you can do a groundwater budgeting balance to show that the water level can be maintained when the drainage area is smaller than 20 acres. And also that the wet pond should be constructed in an area that has a very low permeability soil, or you have to put an impermeable liner. And for the GI wet ponds, I'm seeing there's a rising trend to use the GI wet pond that incorporate with a series of under-drained small-scale BMP. So you would have the small-scale under-drained BMP that provide water quality treatment, and then the runoff would direct to the wet pond for the GI wet pond for water quantity treatment. And by this design, you don't need any waiver or variance. So we are seeing a rising trend that design use this type of the combination. And so in addition, for the non-GI wet pond, there are more requirements than a non-GI wet pond. It needs that for the GI wet pond, for a wet pond that be recognized as GI wet pond, it needs maintain at least a 10-foot wide area of native vegetation along at least 50% of the shoreline. And you need a stormwater runoff retention component that designed to capture stormwater runoff for beneficial reuse, such as irrigation. And for the volume available for beneficial reuse should be equal or greater than 1.25 inches when falling over the drainage area of the GI wet pond. And for the stormwater reuse demand, it's based on the lowest volume that needs occur over any 3 consecutive days during the year. But there may be a case-by-case review, some area or some season that you definitely cannot get the 3 days to use the stored volume in 3 days. So it will be reviewed by case. And also when you have the beneficial reuse, you take out the stored water from the pond, but it should not cause the water level to lower than the permanent pool water level, which means that the beneficial reuse, the volume of the runoff for the beneficial reuse should be added on top of the permanent pool. So when you take out the water from the additional volume, additional to the permanent pool, the water level should not be lower than the permanent pool. And also as I said, the very often design is that the BMP have an under-drain BMP, small scale GI BMP upstream of the GI wet pond, and then direct the runoff going to the GI wet pond for a beneficial reuse. But if you design a small scale GI BMP that infiltrate stone into subsoil, then you don't have any water quality design stone runoff that can provide for the beneficial use into the into the GI wet pond. So you cannot have that kind of design. If you want to incorporate GI wet pump with other small scale BMP, that upstream small scale BMP cannot be designed to infiltrate the water quality design runoff into subsoil. And I want to talk more about the beneficial use, especially within the design that use the stored water quality design storm runoff for landscaping irrigation. And here we are still the point where I'm going to talk about here are not in the GI wet pump chapter. We will update the GI wet pump chapter and to have more detailed requirements and design example for the when you want to use the beneficial when the beneficial reuse being used for the irrigation of landscaping. So basically, the irrigation you can estimate by the NJ Irrigation Guide published by NRCS, and which is one of the methods you can use to estimate the irrigation needs. But you may use other methods to estimate the irrigation needs, but you cannot just randomly put a number, for example, 1.5 inches of the runoff every week without any supporting evidence or any information regarding how you come out the 1.5 inch per week, right? And the NJ irrigation guidance has a very clear step and the data that from NRCS. So it's a good method to have a reasonable estimate of the irrigation needs. So basically the step is including to find the available water capacity of the soil at the landscaping area. And the unit is inch per inch. And but for the AWC here, when you look at the web soil survey, it has this information. But for the situation, if the landscaping, the soil in the landscaping area is not the topsoil from the side, it's from you would have some if you have some other specially mixed soil mixture that for the landscaping, then you may have to do a test for the AWC for the soil mixing and to get the AWC. And then the second step is to find the effective root zone depth of the landscaping vegetation. Different like grass, different grass has different root zone depth. But for example, the bluegrass normally is 6 inches. So you find the effective root zone depth. So, and then you use find the consumptive use in the NJ irrigation guide. It has a 0.2 inch per day for the irrigation use. So then you can, with this information, you know how much the AWC times the root zone depth times the area of the landscaping area. Then you will be able to find the water volume per irrigation. And for the consumptive use, you can know how many cycles of irrigation during 3 days. So you can estimate whether you want to irrigate twice, then the beneficial reuse for the irrigation would be twice of the estimate you have. So there's some additional notes. As I said, that when you can find the AWC from the web soil survey. And when you go there, you will see that there's so different, like the maximum, the minimum, the domain, different way to estimate the AWC, and we will recommend that use the weighted average within the effective rule zone depth for the AWC information. And as I say here, that the consumption in 3 consecutive days for the irrigation that irrigation need for the landscaping. But as I said in previous slides, it may depend on case-by-case situation. We are working with the land use to see how the project goes. And if a township has same kind of project want to review, you can contact us. We can provide a more detailed guidance and work with you. And also, when the design engineer submit the irrigation estimations, normally they will also estimate the loss of the pond due to the evaporation. So that's okay, because the pond, when you be heated under the sun, it would have evaporation, and there is a loss you can count toward to the use. But you cannot, when you have the estimation of the landscaping irrigation through the NRCS irrigation guide, you cannot also add the evapotranspiration for the irrigation area, because the New Jersey irrigation guide, when it estimate the water consumption, is already including the consideration of the evapotranspiration of the irrigation area. So here is that for the wet pond. So the next thing I would like to talk about is the safety requirement in NJAC 7.8-6.2. And the first part of the safety requirement is regarding the grade, the trash rate, and the overflow grade, the spacing, the bar size, and how much those information. And basically, you can get those information from rules, but in our BMP menu, we have a nice illustration to show the requirements. And you can see that it will be much clearer for you to understand the difference between the spacing and between the center to center, those different requirements in the rules. And next part of the safety requirement, more applicable to wet pond for now, is that if you have a permanent pool and you will need safety ledges in the permanent pool part, and here's a requirement. And you can take a look at the rule, or you can see these figures that shows you how that being set up. So next one, I'm going to talk about the MTD design. Dr. McGee in module 2, he discussed about how those MTD being certified. And here I want to discuss more on the practical side, that how you design MTD, how you review a design of MTD to meet stormwater management rules. Under the current stormwater management rules, there are two major categories of the MTD. One is the GI MTD, and the other one is the non-GI MTD. And by the definition, a GI MTD show infiltrate runoff into subsoil, or treat stormwater runoff through infiltration by vegetation of soil. An MTD that use a biofiltration media and can be configured above ground and incorporate a tree box, planter box, or shrub, for example, that will meet the GI MTD definition. And that is important when you can see the MTD design. Some of MTD, they can have the tree box on the top, and also have the biofiltration media. But the manufacturer would say that you can skip the tree box or the vegetation on the top, and then design the MTD entirely under below grade or underground. But in that situation, if you don't have the vegetation on the top, and then you design the MTD entirely underground, then in that situation, it does not meet the GI MTD. So even the certification for that specific MTD is GI MTD, but when you use in that situation, underground situation, it will not meet the GI MTD requirement, and it's not a GI MTD that can use in table as in table 5-1. And also for those MTDs, that you will have to observe that if the MTD is infiltrate being designed, a GI MTD is designed to infiltrate runoff into subsoil. You would have to comply with the minimum season high water separation requirements. And that's for the GI MTD. Another category MTD is the non-GI MTD, which does not infiltrate runoff into subsoil or treated stormwater runoff through filtration by vegetation or soil. And if you want to use under the current rules, if you don't get the variance waiver, you cannot use the non-GI MTD to meet the water quality requirement, but you can use the non-GI MTD as a pre-treatment for the small scale GI BMPs. And you can see our chapter 5 for more detail, our other BMP chapter for more details. And when you look at the MTD, either GI MTD for the MTD that you want to meet the either the pre-treatment or you want to meet the water quality design standards, that the GI MTD the MTD must be verified by NJCAT and also certified by DEP. So you always have to see that the GI the MTD certification letter that attached to the design report and verify whether that the certification is current and valid. And how you sizing the MTD to find the right model is in our certification letter. And you can look at that in our website. And for a GI MTD, the maximum contributory drainage area is 2.5 acres. So you may see the certification letter says that have some model that can exceed 2.5 acres of drainage area. But when you want to use that GI MTD to meet the water quality requirement without getting waiver or a variance, you have to limit the drainage area to be 2.5 acre or smaller. And also because the only specific MTD models from the MTD manufacturer was tested, so the manufacturer's other model not listed in the certification letter, even though they are the same type, cannot be used to meet the water quality design and performance standard. And also the MTD that was tested under specific configuration and installation specification, MTD that deviate from the configuration or installation specification cannot be used to meet the water quality design and performance standards. For example, MTD that has a drawing in the specification data that shows only one inlet, but the same entity shows on the site plan is to be installed with 2 inlets. It will not meet the condition and terms specified in the certification letter. So if the sizing requirement in the certification letter indicate the size is based on the maximum treatment flow rate and the maximum flow inflow impervious area, the model selection must based on the flow rate and the drainage area, whichever results in a highest minimum configuration. And I want to emphasize that the area that can be treated by the MTD is the impervious area. We only consider impervious area. And especially for a GI MTD that's tested and certified based on the treatment provided by the vegetation in MTD, you will see the condition, for example, in the letter requiring the maintenance of 85% vegetation cover in the certification letter. And you will definitely have to see the maintenance plan that has preventive and corrective action to maintain the vegetation cover. And you also want to check the MTD regularly to ensure the vegetation cover is maintained. And there are other design criteria in the MTD certification letter that the design must follow in order to receive a TS renewal rate. Here's another sample language regarding MTD that's underground. Then it will need to either design to infiltrate the entire water quality sandstone in order to be recognized as GIMTD and receive 80% TS renewal rate. So let's talk about something about the calculation of sizing MTD. And one of the criteria is the flow rate, the peak flow rate into the MTD. And normally you can estimate the runoff, the peak flow rate by using an RCS method or use rational method. And very often for now, rational method is used to size an MTD. And you can see the rational method, the question is the peak flow rate equal to the runoff coefficient times the intensity of the runoff of the rainfall and times the drainage area. And many people mistakenly think the intensity of the water quality sandstone is the average of 1.25 inches of rain into 2 hours, and which will become 0.625 inches per hour, and that's incorrect because the rainfall intensity is nonlinear. It cannot be averaged. It's a nonlinear curve. So in our chapter 5, there's a figure 5.5-16. This have the curve, and for example, if you have a time of concentration that's 10 minutes, then the rainfall intensity will be 3.25 inches per hour. And so compared with 0.625 inch per hour, that is really that is underestimate of the rainfall intensity, and then you will result in improper selection of the model. So for the MTD and also the MTD design, in summary, that you have to look into the design criteria. If you look at the BMP menu, there are different sections, and one of the sections have a subtitle called design criteria. So everything within that design criteria section is a must. So you have to meet all the requirements. And other than that, some of this recommended design criteria that is optional. So please take a look of the BMP menu. And also, when you have the multiple BMP, you can use them in series when necessary. But you cannot use same type of MTD in series because the theory is that if one type of MTD that can up to 80% and have some escape from MTD, then the escaped TSS solid, you will not be recaptured by the same type of MTD downstream. So when you have the BMP design in series, you cannot use the same type of BMP together in series. And as I just mentioned, that the intensity of the rainfall must follow the curve. You cannot use average. So next one, I would like to discuss about the groundwater recharge. And the rule requirements are either one, demonstrate that 100% of the pre-development groundwater recharge is maintained, or infiltrate the difference in the 2-year runoff volume. Then let's talk about the second one because that's much easier to meet. It's a simple calculation. When you do the water quantity, you certainly know the pre and post development 2-year storm volume. So you can simply design a BMP that accommodate that the volume difference in the 2-year storm. But as our experience that will result into a larger infiltration structure, and you may have a greater mounting height. And as we say, you have to assess the groundwater hydraulic, and which in this case, it will be much easier to fail the passing the groundwater mounting analysis. So when you calculate 2-year storm difference, you cannot use the rational method because the rational method is meant for peak flow rate. To calculate the peak flow rate, it does not give you the volume. So you have to use NRCS method. Then you have to see the pre and post construction 2 years runoff volume, and then you can estimate the volume difference. And just one note that when you use the NRCS method, you have to match the curve number and time of concentration. That sometimes you see that they use one curve number, time concentration when they calculate the water quality design storm, and then they use different sets of the numbers in the 2-year storm. You have to see that should be consistent. The second one is to maintain the 100% of the pre-development groundwater recharge. And for this requirement, you will have to use the groundwater New Jersey groundwater recharge spreadsheets. There's no other tools you can do the estimation. So you have to use the pre and post, then use development, and then you have to look into your BMP design. So let's talk about more detail about this the spreadsheets. So here is the first page of the spreadsheets, and the orange shaded area are for loss input. The gray area, that's output, you cannot change it. And let's look at the input required on the first page. On the left of the page, there are input for the pre-construction condition, and right side are those input for post-construction conditions. And just to emphasize again that the groundwater recharge is the infiltration after the vegetation taking out the runoff that need for the need for the vegetation. So the recharge would be less than the infiltration that from the BMP. So on page 1, the input is the municipality, pre and post land cover, and the pre and post soil. And as stated earlier, the volume of the groundwater recharge is the volume infiltrate the subsoil and pass through the vegetation zone. So the land cover is used to determine that how much the runoff is infiltrate into the subsoil, and the soil series is used to determine the depth of the zone and also the recharge that can passing the soil series. And that spreadsheet would calculate the pre and post annual recharge. You can see there's a number that it's annual recharge on the left hand side, and then for the pre-construction condition, and on the right hand side for the post-construction condition. And the difference between those pre and post is the annual deficit. And here are some input and reviewing the pre-input of the spreadsheet, that the soil and the land cover must match the site plan. And the soil determined by, you can have the soil divided by the soil web soil survey, or you can use the chapter 12 default. And the areas, the acreage of the pre and post development input in the spreadsheet first page show match. And about the default soil series that being used for the groundwater recharge spreadsheet, that's here is the table. So if that, for example, if in that the web soil survey shows is an urban area and it does not give you any soil series for the area, then you can use the default soil group here. And let's move on the second page. After you complete the input in first page, then you move to the second page, and here's the design and of the BMP. And same for this, as that the orange are the inputs and the gray are output. And let's talk about some parameters that inputs that are needed for the spreadsheet to work. And the red letter on the right side, if you look at the previous slide, the table, the screenshot of the spreadsheet, the red letter on the right side shows the status of whether the calculations are correct. And there are 3 buttons that titled the solve for BMP and the VDF and DBMP. That means the area or the volume or the depth of the water in the BMP. And actually, when you input those factors, whether the design of the BMP can provide sufficient recharge will be immediately show on the status in the red letters. So you don't have to really click on those buttons. You will automatically populate it and then give you a result. And if you look at the table, the spreadsheet, there's one called the BMP location, the segment. And since the different soil has different zones, and the soil at the location of BMP will be important factor to determine the amount of runoff in the BMP that can pass the zone. So the BMP location should be the land segment where the BMP to be located in the post-construction side on the input sheets. If the location of the BMP is not input, the default value is 0, and which represents that average root zone depth for the all soil series under post-construction condition. And that the spreadsheet will use the average root zone from different soil series that present in the site to calculate how much the water will be taken by the vegetation. So if it's in a planning phase, then you may use 0 because you have not decide where do you want to put a BMP. But when you go down to the detailed design and have allocate where the location you want to put the BMP, then you should change the segment number to the specific segment, the length that you want to put the BMP. And on that second page also has a post-development deficit recharge. And by default, it's the post-development annual recharge deficit from the first page. However, it can have different value. For example, if you have 2 BMP, each BMP will be responsible for a portion of the annual deficit for the first page. Then you will need 2 spreadsheets and split the annual recharge deficit into 2 spreadsheets and calculate the BMP provided by each BMP separately. And for the input post D impervious area, our target impervious area is the size of the impervious surface that contributing the runoff into a BMP. So I want to emphasize that for the current spreadsheet, that the site is only can calculate the runoff from impervious runoff. That means the CN number is 98. It does not count any service that less than CN number less than 98. So you can only input the impervious in this, the size of the impervious service in here. And in some situation, not all the impervious service would contribute to a specific BMP. For example, you may have the runoff from a part of the impervious service direct to a GI waste pond, but some of that does not provide recharge. But you would have part of the runoff that goes to another to an infiltration basin, small scale infiltration basin. And then you would have to split. You would have to split the impervious surface into 2 spreadsheets and input them separately, and then get the recharge that provided by the runoff from the impervious surface for the recharge. And we already talked about the segment BMP is that where you want to put the BMP, the recharge BMP. Under the post-development situation. And if this pervious paving system, then segment should be the impervious area of the post-development. So next one is ABMP, is the BMP area for infiltration. And the size of the BMP, they are not counted for the infiltration. So normally the slope. So only the center area, that's flat area, they can count as the infiltration area. So, and that is a BMP. And another input is the DBMPU, is the vertical distance from the vegetated ground surface to the maximum water level of the BMP. So you have to know where is the maximum water in the BMP, and you know whether the BMP bottom is vegetated or not. And if that the bottom of the BMP is not vegetated, you look around the elevation of the ground surrounding the BMP, that will be the vegetated ground for this input. And for the DEXC, means the vertical distance from the vegetated ground surface to the bottom of the BMP. So let's look at 3 different scenarios. For this scenario, the DEXC there is the vegetated ground to the bottom of the BMP because they are on the same at the same elevation. So there will be DEXC will be 0. And for the DBMPU, it's the vegetated ground where the maximum water level. And if the water is above the vegetation, that the value for DBMPU is negative. And for this scenario, it may be infiltration basin because infiltration basin does not allow vegetation on the bottom. So now you look at the DSC would be the bottom to the surrounding ground elevation, and the DBMPU will be the water level, the maximum water level to the surrounding ground elevation. So, and that value will be the positive. And the other situation is like here, you have the infiltration, you have a BMP that provide recharge is underground, and it has been filled with aggregate. So again, the DXC will be from the bottom to the ground, and the DBMPU will be the top of the storage area for the runoff to the ground. And because the vegetation on the ground is above, so above the water level, so it's a positive value. And don't ask me why we have so awkward design of like BMP positive and negative values that was being developed in early 2006, or even earlier. So we don't know why at the time they designed the spreadsheet like this way. So please bear with us. So here's one mini example to talk about those inputs, give you a sense of how you put the input. Here is the profile of the BMP that will provide recharge, and you can see the ground at elevation 12 feet. There is totally there's no vegetation, and then you have the water quality sandstone, and then have the 2-year stone, and then have the surrounding ground elevation. And in this case, you can see that the orifice from the site plan, it was designed. The orifice is at 13.36, which is not the water quality design stone. Actually, is that you can see that it's a 2-year stone because this BMP is designed to infiltrate more than the water quality design stone. And you can see the scenario for this specific BMP would be that the unvegetated service recharge BMP. So you can see those. You can compare this site plan and the scenario, and then you can get the input. So the DBMPU will be the from the vegetated ground, there will be the ground elevation surrounding the BMP, not the elevation of the burn. It's like the area, the vegetation area surround the BMP minus the maximum water level. So you will get 1.64 feet. And for the DEXC, there will be the bottom to the surrounding ground, so that you would get 3 feet. And for the BMP effect depth is the water depth, which is 1.36 feet. And from the engineers' design information, we know that the volume below the outlet is 59,400 cubic feet. And then how do you get the DBMP? So the DBMP, the depth of the how do you get the area? Because you know the volume, you know the depth of the water, so you would get the ABMP That is the area. So by using the volume divided by the depth. So that's useful when you have BMP that is irregular shape. Then you don't have the length and width to get easily to get the size of the infiltration area or the ABMP. Then you can use this method to get the estimate of the ABMP value. So if this BMP is designed as a bioretention system, which has the vegetation on the bottom, you will get the same ABMP, same DBMP, but since the vegetated area is underneath the water, so it's a negative value, and also the value will be different from when you compare from the water level to the surrounding ground. And in this case, the DEXC will be 0 in compare with the DEXC in the scenario that vegetation on the ground, and there's no vegetation on the bottom of the BMP. There will be a value other than 0. So that will result in different recharge that provided by the BMP. So something about the groundwater recharge, we have been seeing the same similar question that's been asked in previous presentation. So when you have the recharge of stormwater with high pollutant loading or industrial stormwater that exposed to source material, you cannot recharge that portion of runoff into groundwater subsoil. But for other area that does not have this situation, you will have to still to provide groundwater recharge for the area. And you have to design a BMP that to meet the infiltration criteria and structure design in the BMP menu. And also when you do the infiltration, a BMP that's been designed for infiltration runoff into subsoil, you have to consider the hydraulic impact on the groundwater table, which means the groundwater recharge mounting, the groundwater mounting analysis. So in summary, I talk about the how those BMP chapters, the design criteria. I highlight some of them, but you please go to read those chapters when you reviewing or when you are designing a BMP. And I also talk about the safety requirement for the trash rake, overflow grade, and also the safety ledge. And I touch upon the MTD design, and also I have brief explanation of the groundwater recharge requirements. So if you have questions, it's welcome to give me an email. I will happy to answer your questions.
Hey, Changyi.
Yeah.
Speaking of questions, we have a number of questions in the chat. So we weren't sure if you would want to go through them. It is 9 minutes after 3. So we wanted to leave it to you if you wanted to answer them during a break, or if you felt it was important, given the hour, that we should move straight into the next presentation. I don't mean to cut you off.
Yes, we can move to next presentation, and I can answer those questions in the chat. And
Okay.
if there's some question I cannot answer, I can get back to you later during the training. So let's continue the presentation.
Thank you, Changyi. All right, so when you go through the chat, you'll go back to 2:16 p.m. The first question is from Jared Thomas.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so with that, we're going to skip the break and Peter is going to move into the groundwater mounding presentation. So please bear with us while Peter takes control. Peter, you ready?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. I will share my screen here. All right, so it's Peter Plantos here from the Municipal Stormwater Engineering Unit. In this presentation, we're going to dive into the groundwater mounding analysis requirements and calculations necessary for the use of infiltration BMPs. This material is covered in depth in Chapter 13 of the BMP Manual. My goal with this presentation is to cover the requirements under the stormwater management rules, as well as concepts, methods of calculation, and examples, all in relation to groundwater mounding analysis. The rules require we assess the hydraulic impact of the proposed development on the groundwater table and design the site to avoid adverse impacts. Well, in order to describe what is an adverse impact, let's take a look at what happens when we infiltrate stormwater. Below the surface, the groundwater table rises locally, and then it needs some time to spread out before returning to stasis. When we force a concentrated amount into one area, we get mounding. This increase slows down the ability of the basin to infiltrate, so we can have problems if this increase is large enough to slow down the rate of infiltration beyond our 72-hour window, or from repeating this slowing down over and over, the basin can experience failure. Additionally, as this mounding spreads out, it can reach adjacent structures such as basements and septic systems. Let's look at a nice graphic that illustrates this. This illustration is in the paper prepared by Glenn Carlton from the United States Geological Society, or USGS. We have a house near an infiltration basin. The blue color area below everything is known as the saturated zone, whose top surface is the seasonal high water table. Imagine, if you will, that it rained. The rain has now stopped and runoff has collected in the basin. As stormwater infiltrates below the bottom of the basin, we get a temporary localized increase or mounding below the basin that is caused by stormwater infiltrating into the subsoils after the storm event. In order to dissipate, the volume of water under the curve has to move outward and downward until it returns to how it was before the rain. We need to calculate the maximum height of the mounding in order to assess the impact of infiltrating stormwater on the basin and on nearby structures. One method of calculating the height of groundwater mounding is covered in Chapter 13. That method, known as the Hantush equation, dates back to 1967. It requires a computing capability such as that found in the Excel spreadsheet developed by the USGS. You basically enter in certain parameters and then click the Calculate button to see the results plotted. Additionally, the user gets results in the cells of a spreadsheet. There are certain ground rules, pun intended, for using the spreadsheet, so we'll go over what parameters we need to define, and then we'll look at making sense of the plot the spreadsheet creates by virtue of a macro. This is a screenshot of the Hantush spreadsheet. If you have used a spreadsheet in the past, you may find this spreadsheet a little bit different from the spreadsheet that was posted on the USGS website. That's because in March 2020, DEP published and adopted a new BMP manual chapter titled Chapter 13, Groundwater Table Hydraulic Impact Assessments for Infiltration BMPs, which provides both detailed guidance regarding the input values and examples illustrating how to conduct the groundwater mounding analysis. With permission from the USGS, we modified the spreadsheet. Here's how it looks today. All the calculation algorithms are the same, but the units and the notes on the use of the inputs are modified to be consistent with the other chapters of the BMP manual. Chapter 13 and the spreadsheet are available at the link shown on this slide. To get more familiar with the Hantush spreadsheet, Let's define the parameters listed here and establish the assumptions for their use in the spreadsheet. The first input parameter is the recharge rate. In the spreadsheet, you must use the design value for the vertical saturated soil hydraulic conductivity, which is 1/2 of the tested value of the vertical saturated soil hydraulic conductivity from soil testing performed in accordance with Chapter 12 of the BMP manual. The second input is the horizontal hydraulic conductivity, which is rarely tested on the scale of a single site just for the purpose of conducting a groundwater mounting analysis. Therefore, you will need to use presumptive values based on the site's location. If the site is located in the coastal plain, then the horizontal saturated soil hydraulic conductivity is presumed to be 5 times the recharge rate, meaning the vertical saturated soil hydraulic conductivity. If the site is located outside the coastal plain, the horizontal saturated soil hydraulic conductivity is presumed to be the same as the recharge rate, again, the same as the vertical saturated soil hydraulic conductivity. If you recall, Lisa provided us in Module 2 with the link to the Bureau of GIS website where you can determine if your site is in the coastal plain. The next parameter is the specific yield, which is the volume of water that will drain from a soil specimen due to gravity divided by the total volume of the soil specimen. Coarse soil will likely have a higher specific yield than fine-grained soil having the same porosity. Specific yield governs how much water the unsaturated zone can store when recharge reaches the water table. The more water that can be stored in the unsaturated zone, the lower the resulting mounding. Therefore, a soil having a higher specific yield may result in a lower mounding height than a soil having a lower specific yield when other inputs remain the same. For groundwater mounting purposes, specific yield is not calculated by subtracting field capacity from porosity. The hand-touch spreadsheet assumes that the BMP is rectangular in shape and the sides of the BMP are vertical. So we use the width and length of the bottom area of the BMP, also called the footprint, but since the mounting is at the center of the BMP, for graphing purposes, we use 1/2 of each dimension as the inputs for the length and the width, which correspond to the X and Y axes, respectively, as the inputs. Now, for circular shaped BMPs, you want to use the radius of the circular basin as both X and Y. For irregular shaped BMPs, you want to convert the shape to a rectangular shape that has the same depth of stormwater runoff to be infiltrated and is best fitted to the original shape. And then if a BMP is designed with sloped sides, use the bottom footprint as the length and the width of the BMP and use the total volume of the runoff to be infiltrated divided by the area of the bottom footprint to calculate the duration of infiltration period. We're going to define the duration of infiltration period in 2 slides, so just bear with me. For the initial thickness of the saturated zone, unless proven by a field test showing the thickness of the saturated zone beneath the proposed BMP, the default value is 10 feet. Note that the thickness of saturated zone used in the hand-touch spreadsheet is not the thickness of a large regional aquifer. It is the distance from the seasonal high water table to the first hydraulically restrictive layer. If a value greater than 10 feet is used, it must be accompanied by on-site testing results that demonstrate the value used is appropriate. The input value must never exceed 75 feet, which is based on the preliminary results of research conducted by the USGS. The exact maximum allowed value may be subject to revision based on the final results of the research. Any on-site boring used to justify a value greater than 10 feet must be a continuous sampling boring for the entire drilled depth. The duration of the infiltration period, P, is equal to the time required for the BMP to drain the volume of stormwater runoff at the specified recharge rate, and is equal to the volume of runoff to be infiltrated divided by the product of the infiltration area and the recharge rate, where the volume of runoff to be infiltrated may be either the runoff volume produced by the water quality design storm or the volume of runoff to be discharged through exfiltration, if exfiltration of runoff during basin routing is used. The maximum duration of infiltration period that may be used in the hand-touch spreadsheet is 72 hours. There are some other important relationships to understand. Delta H max is the maximum height of the mounding, and the value calculated by the hand-touch spreadsheet is that which occurs at the end of the duration of infiltration period. This is explained on page 17 of chapter 13. However, the hand-touch spreadsheet does not further calculate the mounding as it spreads out over time. We'll talk about this further in just a moment. A lower mounding height will happen when the horizontal hydraulic conductivity increases, specific yield increases, or the initial thickness of the saturated zone increases. You cannot just use the results from the spreadsheet as it appears. The results have to be checked against the physical constraints of the design. If you get a resulting mounding height that is higher than the distance between the basin bottom and the seasonal high water table, you do not get an artesian condition. It means the recharge rate is adversely impacted by a reduced hydraulic gradient and will be slower. This means you'll have to run the spreadsheet again after you make some changes. Because there is a proportionality between the recharge rate and the duration of infiltration, as shown in this equation, the changes include using a smaller recharge rate and a correspondingly longer duration of infiltration for the same infiltration area and the same volume of runoff to be infiltrated. Furthermore, if the mounding height just touches the bottom of the BMP, the rate of recharge will also be slower than the design value for the vertical saturated soil hydraulic conductivity. When this happens, you can stretch the duration of infiltration period while decreasing the recharge rate, or you can spread the volume of runoff to be infiltrated over a larger area. When opting to increase the footprint, you'll be able to use a shallower depth. There are some limitations associated with how the hand-touch spreadsheet operates. The graph produced by the spreadsheet is comparable to a snapshot in time of the mounding that occurs at the end of the duration of infiltration period. Since it's a snapshot, it does not depict what happens over time, as the mounding height decays and spreads out. During decay, while the maximum mounding height will be smaller, the mounding will expand into the horizontal direction. This means that if an underground structure appears to be above the mounding predicted by the spreadsheet, or out of range of the mounding altogether, it may still be inundated when the mounding height decays. Therefore, caution should be used when applying the spreadsheet to analyze adverse impacts to subsurface structures in proximity to an infiltration BMP. Now that we better understand the inputs to the hand-touch spreadsheet and the results it provides, let's go to some examples that illustrate the method and what to do with the results. The examples presented today are two of the ones included in Chapter 13 and are arranged from simplest to more complex. After a straightforward example, we'll look at an analysis that shows infiltration will be at a slower rate than the design saturated soil hydraulic conductivity and what changes need to be made because we encounter an impact. In other words, we'll see two different scenarios. For the first example, a major development located in the coastal plain proposes an infiltration basin, whose bottom footprint measures 50 feet by 50 feet, to infiltrate 5,000 cubic feet of runoff generated by the water quality design storm. Other key notes here include the maximum depth of ponding water is designed to be 2 feet. Soil testing was performed in accordance with Chapter 12. The soil testing report shows that the seasonal high water table is 7.5 feet below the 6-inch thick bottom sand layer of the basin. The tested soil permeability rate of the most restricted soil horizon below the basin is 4 inches per hour, and no nearby underground structures are present. All right, so let's start with some basic calculations. Typically, the soil testing provides results in inches per hour, so the value for T would also use hours as the unit of measure. For the duration of infiltration period, we divide the volume of runoff to be infiltrated by the product of the infiltration area and the recharge rate. Also, remember that the recharge rate is 1/2 the tested the slowest tested saturated soil hydraulic conductivity rate from soil testing. Therefore, the duration of infiltration period is calculated to be 12 hours. When using the hand-touch spreadsheet, it is helpful to make a table of the inputs and the results, so they are ready to be added in later to the report. These inputs are organized to follow the order they appear in the hand-touch spreadsheet. The recharge rate is the first parameter entered into the hand-touch spreadsheet, but it needs to be converted to feet per day if you are using the older version. Feet per day is just inches per hour times 2. So here we would use 4 feet per day for R. The specific yield is set equal to the default value, 0.15. The horizontal hydraulic conductivity is equal to 5 times the recharge rate, since the infiltration basin is located in the coastal plain. The basin measures 50 feet by 50 feet, so we would just input 1/2 of each of those dimensions, since the analysis is performed at the center of the basin. The duration of infiltration period is obtained from step 1. We also need to divide hours by 24 to get the number of days, which is 0.5 for this example, if we're using the older spreadsheet. T is less than the upper limit of 3 days. And then the initial thickness of the saturated zone uses the default value, 10 feet. Alternatively, you can grab screenshots from the input section of the hand-touch spreadsheet, shown here with the parameter values from the previous slide entered in the gold shaded cells. This version of the spreadsheet is one that allows time to be input in hours rather than days and recharge in inches per hour. With the inputs entered, I clicked the dark blue Recalculate Now button and took this screenshot after the macro finished plotting the blue curve. The results show in the red cell in row 16 the maximum height of groundwater mounding, represented by the variable delta H max equals 6.07 feet, which I have circled in light blue, and this is what will occur at the end of the duration of infiltration period. To put this into proper context, I've also superimposed a symbol representing 1/2 of the bottom of the basin. Since the seasonal high water table, which the spreadsheet always sets at y = 0, is 7.5 feet below the bottom of the sand layer, the temporarily elevated groundwater table located at y = 6.07 feet at the center of the basin, where x = 0, will not reach the bottom of the sand layer. Therefore, the assessment shows no adverse hydraulic impact to the proposed infiltration BMP from the groundwater mounding. Remember that had the height of the mounding been high enough to intersect the bottom of the basin, it would mean the mounding would interfere with the infiltration capability of the basin. We would have to run a new model or trial that would involve increasing the basin footprint to spread out the volume of the stormwater being infiltrated. That would result in a lower depth of stormwater runoff in the basin, since the volume is the same, and the duration of infiltration period would have to be recalculated before the spreadsheet is run again with these new parameter values. If you recall the duration of infiltration period equation from slide 21, the footprint area is in the denominator, so we would see the duration of infiltration period decrease proportionally as the area increases. Next, let's talk about when things go wrong. Meaning adverse impacts. This slide is not for the example I just presented. It is meant to show you what happens in the spreadsheet when the groundwater mounding height is too high. If you click on the dark blue Recalculate Now button and the results show delta H max and the area I have circled is larger than the distance from the seasonal high water table to the bottom of your BMP, you won't be able to tell just by looking at the graph. In this case, the seasonal high water table is 8 feet below the bottom of a basin that is 90 feet in length. The height of the mounding is calculated to be 9.51 feet. The plot by itself looks normal, but is it? We have to understand what is being plotted and check it against the reality of our design. The depth to the seasonal high water table is 8 feet. This does not mean groundwater will rise up in real life above the basin like this. So yeah, it's not going to rise up above the bottom of the basin as depicted there. So it means that the temporary elevation in the groundwater table located at the center line and above the seasonal high water table will intersect and exceed the elevation of the bottom of the sand layer, meaning it interferes with the infiltration capability, and therefore it will take the BMP longer to drain. Adjustment of the basin design is therefore needed to reduce the impact of groundwater mounding. So we have to adjust our parameters and run the spreadsheet again. To do that, we have to reduce the value for R. We don't know exactly how much it will slow, but my first attempt would try reducing it by 50%. However, we are not ready to click Recalculate. The horizontal hydraulic conductivity is not adjusted since it is not affected by the reduced hydraulic gradient in the vertical direction. However, the duration of infiltration period must be proportionally adjusted to reflect the slowing down. For example, we would double the initial value for T if we halved R. Although we don't know the exact rate to which the rate would slow, even if it is slowed by 1/2, we're going to check the mounding for a value of T that is within the maximum allowable time period. Sometimes we call this stretching the infiltration period. Next, we click Recalculate and check the results to see if delta H max is now less than the distance between the seasonal high water table and the bottom of the BMP. You might try this one more time with T a bit longer, as long as the R value is proportionally reduced. If that doesn't work, you're going to check Chapter 13 for an example of changing the dimensions of the infiltration area. With that explained, let's move on to our second example. We're going to look at a dry well for the example of an adverse impact. Even a small BMP can cause one. All right, so a site located outside the coastal plain. A site is located outside of the coastal plain, excuse me. A 7-foot high by 5-foot diameter dry well is proposed to store and infiltrate 137.4 cubic feet of roof runoff from a single family home for the water quality design storm. The house has a basement floor located just above the groundwater table. The edges of the dry well are 10 feet away from the house. Soil testing was performed in accordance with Chapter 12. The soil testing report shows that the seasonal high water table is 2 feet below the bottom of the dry well, and the tested soil permeability rate of the most restrictive soil horizon below the dry well is 4 inches per hour. And the dry well is circular, so we calculate its area to be 19.6 square feet and input it into that equation at the bottom of the slide to calculate the duration of infiltration to be 42 hours. Using the same type of chart, here are the values for our input parameters. 1/2 of the slowest tested saturated soil hydraulic conductivity rate is used for the recharge rate in the spreadsheet. The specific yield is the default value, 0.15. The horizontal hydraulic conductivity is the same as the recharge rate since the site is located outside of the coastal plain. The duration of infiltration period is 42 hours. And the initial thickness of the saturated zone uses the default value of 10 feet. The results show the maximum height of groundwater mounding, 1.11 feet, that will occur at the end of the duration of infiltration period at the center of the dry well. The temporary groundwater mounding does not encroach upon the bottom of the dry well, where it would have impaired infiltration had the mounding extended that high. Are we done? No. The rules require we also check the impact to the adjacent structure. Recall that the vertical axis is situated at the center line of the dry well, and the groundwater mounding curve is symmetrical on both sides of the vertical axis. The basement is 10 feet away from the edge of the dry well, which is 12.5 feet to the left of the center of the dry well. The spreadsheet results indicate the water table is also temporarily raised approximately 0.4 feet at the basement wall location nearest the dry well, which is an adverse impact prohibited by the rules. Therefore, the dry well may need to be moved farther from the building to avoid the adverse impact caused by the proposed infiltration. Per the USGS paper, an increase of 0.25 feet or less is an acceptable depth for underground structures to be temporarily affected by groundwater mounding. The mounding height at 20 feet from the dry well is just less than that. But considering the limitations of the hand-touch spreadsheet I brought up earlier, it would be advised to place the dry well even farther than 20 feet from the basement, since the mounding decay, which is not modeled, may result in a rising of the groundwater level at the basement area higher than as it is shown in the hand-touch spreadsheet. This example shows that even a small infiltration BMP may have an adverse impact on nearby underground structures. If you haven't read it, Chapter 13 includes a lot more examples. Please see Example 7 in the chapter for guidance when replacing soil below an infiltration BMP. Also, Chapter 5 includes examples with groundwater mounding analyses and includes exfiltration in the routings, which is allowed in certain circumstances for the green infrastructure
Hopefully get the
BMPs.
AC done today.
All right, so thanks everybody for your attention. Here's my contact info, and I'm going to check with our moderator if we're answering any questions and how we're doing with time.
Hey, Peter, thank you very much. It was great how you really motored through that. The time is 3:37, so I think I'm going to introduce Manesh, and we'll start the quiz, or the preliminary part to it, and then folks can take their break if they finish their quiz early, so that way we can get done in the time we've allotted for the day. How's that sound to everybody? Okay.
Sounds good.
All right, Manesh, when you're ready, just turn your microphone on.
All right, thanks, Lisa. So, hello again. It's time for quiz 3. I'm going to take you through all the steps here really quickly because you've seen them numerous times already. As I'm sure you remember, you have the option to follow the link shown on this slide to open the training website in a new tab or your browser, where you'll find the quiz links at the bottom. Or you can use the camera app on a smartphone to scan the QR code found in the bottom right here. Once you click on the link for quiz 3, you'll be directed to the quiz, which is now on SurveyMonkey. I believe it should be open now. Note the quiz link and QR code will be posted in the chat by our staff. Also, make sure to click submit at the end of the quiz to get credit for completing it. So here's everything all in one place. Just a reminder, the quiz link is also in the body of the email that was sent for the invite to this module. So if for some reason you're having trouble clicking it in the chat, you can also go back to the email. It is now 3:38, so please take about 15 minutes. So 3:53, we'll come back and start our quiz review.
Hi, sorry for the delay. I see that we have a hand raised. Let's see. Could you unmute yourself if you have your hand up and let me know how I can help you?
Just disregard.
Hello?
Oh, just disregard.
Oh, okay. Then all you have to do is click the raise and it should lower your hand.
It's not doing it.
Um, okay. There. It seems to have disappeared. Frederick Turek, how can we be of help? Okay, well, we have a few minutes left and I see that we're at 74% completion. I do see one hand raised, so Frederick Turek, turn your mic back on and let me know how we can be of help.
Accident, and I apologize.
Oh, okay, no problem. Happens all the time. If you can, just lower your hand, and things will be all okay. Okay, folks, we're gonna get the review underway at the time that we said. No rush, just do the best you can to answer it. We do need your completed quizzes for the attendance record, and please stick around for the answers. And with that, Manesh will be back in just a moment.
All right, everyone, welcome back. It's 3:53 now, so let's get to the review of quiz 3. So jumping right into question 4, which one of the following is not a green infrastructure BMP? And the answer to that is D, extended detention basins, which are found in Chapter 11 of BMP manual. They're not considered GI. Small scale bioretention basins, vegetative filter strips, and impervious paving systems are all GI BMPs, and they're all found in Chapter 9 of our BMP manual. Question 5, when reviewing water quantity calculations, which of the following must the reviewer check for accuracy? And it's all the above. There are various things you need to check, and land covers, basin design, and hydrographs must all be checked for accuracy in a site review for water quantity. Question 6, which of the following conditions must be met when a stormwater BMP is allowed to infiltrate the entire runoff from the 2, 10, or 100-year storm? And the answer to that is D, all of the above. So infiltration of the entire 2, 10, or 100-year storm is allowed only when existing site conditions are such that no runoff leaves the site for the pre-construction condition scenario, thereby constraining the design to infiltrate 100% of the volume produced by the post-construction condition for the same design storm. The maximum storm that can be entirely infiltrated is the largest storm event with no runoff leaving the site in the pre-construction condition. So for example, if there's no runoff, say for the pre-construction 10-year storm, but there is for the 100-year storm, then for the proposed condition, the maximum design storm that can be fully infiltrated is the 10-year storm. And then the answers for B and C, they paraphrase what is in the rules. Only small scale GI BMPs can be used to infiltrate runoff of a storm larger than the water quality design storm, unless required by another rule or agency. And soil testing of saturated hydraulic conductivity must be performed strictly following Chapter 12 of the BMP manual. Question 7, what is required as part of the municipal stormwater management plan to grant variances or exemptions from the design and performance standards? And the answer to that is C, a mitigation plan. Municipality must have an approved mitigation plan as part of its municipal stormwater management plan to grant variances or exemptions from the design and performance standards. This is going to be revisited a little bit more in Thursday's module as well. Question 8, if you have an impervious surface that has existed for 10 years, but have removed this impervious surface prior to the submission of the application that includes a stormwater management review component, can you still use this impervious surface as an existing condition in the stormwater management calculations? And the answer to that is B, no. So we use the land cover that has the lowest runoff potential that existed on site in the past 5 years for the existing condition. So if you remove impervious cover, anything you replaced it with is going to have a lower curve number, regardless of when that impervious cover was removed. So impervious surfaces removed prior to the application cannot be counted as an existing condition. Question 9, true or false? If a project has been reviewed by the NJDEP Division of Watershed Protection and Restoration, formerly known as dealer or land use, the municipality does not have to review it for compliance with its Stormwater Control Ordinance or RSIS. And the answer here is B, false. So the municipality is required to review all projects that trigger their definition of major development, regardless of whether they were reviewed by the NJDEP Division of Watershed Protection and Restoration or any other regulatory agency. Remember, the municipality may have a slight difference in its definition of major development and can even be more strict than the definition in the stormwater management rules. Question 10, which of the following would be exempt from the groundwater recharge standard? And the answer is B. So just being in planning area 1 is not an allowed exemption from the groundwater recharge standard, nor is redevelopment automatically exempt. Only previously developed portions of sites in the designated locations listed on the slide can be exempted. Question 11, true or false? Reducing impervious surfaces on a redevelopment project always meets the water quantity control standard. And the answer here is B, false. Reducing impervious surface can help meet the quantity standard, but you would still need to be compliant with one of the 3 water quantity options. Question 12, can an infiltration basin be designed with a perforated underdrain pipe as a means of discharging runoff from the basin? And the answer is B, no. An infiltration BMP cannot have an underdrain pipe if it wants to meet the criteria for an infiltration basin in the BMP manual. Question 13, true or false? The TSS removal rate requirement must be met on each subdrainage area of a site unless the discharge from each drainage area converges to a single discharge point on site. And the answer here is A, true. You know you have to meet the standards for each drainage area, but also be aware that if runoff from drainage areas convergent on site and no adverse environmental impact would occur as a result of compliance with any one or more of the individual standards that's being determined utilizing a weighted average of the results achieved for that individual standard across the affected drainage areas. Question 14, when sizing a MTD by the rational method for the water quality design storm, 1.25 inches in 2 hours, if the time concentration is calculated as 10 minutes, which rainfall intensity shall be used? And the answer is B, 3.2 inches per hour. So in accordance with figure 516 in chapter 5 of the BMP manual, the rainfall intensity is 3.2 inches per hour when the time of concentration is 10 minutes. Question 15, when can a wet pond be considered to be a green infrastructure BMP? And the answer here is C, both statements above must be met. So in accordance with note D in tables 5.1, 5.2, and 5.3, only a wet pond designed to maintain at least a 10-foot wide area of native vegetation along at least 50% of the shoreline and includes stormwater runoff retention component designed to capture stormwater runoff for beneficial reuses such as irrigation cannot be considered a GI BMP in table 5-2. Question 16, true or false? When the groundwater mounding reaches the bottom of a BMP designed to infiltrate, the infiltration into the subsoil would be adversely impacted. The answer here is A, true. So yes, when the mounding reaches the bottom of an infiltrating BMP, the hydraulic gradient is going to be reduced significantly, and the flow rate infiltrated through the BMP is going to be reduced as well. Question 17, what method is used to calculate the groundwater mounding height? And the answer here is C, the hand-touch spreadsheet. It's the name of the spreadsheet we have for groundwater mounding. It's used to calculate the maximum height of the groundwater mounding directly below the basin. Okay, so that's the end of our quiz review, and that's the end of module 3.